Hong Kong, 1972. The film set was supposed to be closed. No press, no visitors, no uninvited eyes. Just cameras, crew, and the controlled choreography of a movie being made. That was the agreement. That was what the production company had arranged, what the studio had paid for, what everyone on that set had signed paperwork to protect. But word had gotten out. Word always gets out. And by 9 o'clock that morning, there were 43 people standing outside the perimeter of that set who had no business being there. Crew from neighboring productions, drivers, a journalist who had traded 3 favors to get within visual range, local fighters, men who trained in gyms across Kowloon, men who had spent years hearing the name Bruce Lee spoken in a certain tone of voice that made them need to see for themselves. And one man who had come specifically to prove something. His name was Willem Krause, and everything about what happened in the next 4 minutes would be argued about, whispered about, and carefully not written about for the next 50 years. You need to understand who Willem Krause was before you can understand what he did. He wasn't a nobody. That's the important thing. Men who are nobodies don't count. Anyone can dismiss a nobody. What makes a story true is when the man who shows up is someone you cannot dismiss, someone whose credentials are real, whose size is real, whose confidence is earned rather than borrowed. Krause was 31 years old, 6'2", 240 pounds of competitive weight, the kind that comes from discipline rather than bulk. He had trained in Dutch kickboxing for 9 years, had competed across Southeast Asia in the circuits that existed before anyone was putting names and rules on them. He had a professional record that the record books of the time don't fully capture, because many of those bouts happened in rooms where nobody was keeping records. What the people who saw those bouts remembered was simpler than statistics. He hit hard, he hit fast for his size, and he did not go down. He had been in Hong Kong for 6 weeks, working as a stunt consultant on a separate production. And in those 6 weeks, he had heard the Bruce Lee mythology playing on a loop from every direction. The 1-inch punch, the speed that cameras couldn't catch, the men twice his size who had been sent stumbling across training rooms. Krause had listened to all of it with the careful patience of a man who has heard similar things said about other men and has personal, physical...
What was cleared in the next 10 minutes was a space approximately 20 feet by 20 feet on the far edge of the set, away from the cameras, away from the expensive equipment, onto the bare concrete that bordered the shooting area. Someone produced 2 pairs of light sparring gloves. Krause declined his pair. Bruce Lee set his aside without comment. 30 people arranged themselves at the perimeter of the space. Nobody spoke above a murmur. The journalist, the one who had traded 3 favors to be there, stood near the back and did not, in the end, take out his notebook. He told someone about it years later. I understood immediately that this was not something I was going to write about. This was something I was going to watch. Samo stood slightly apart from the group, arms folded, face doing nothing. He had seen this before. He knew what was coming. He watched anyway, because you always watch. Bruce Lee and Willem Krause stood approximately 10 feet apart on the bare concrete and looked at each other. The size difference was significant and visible. Krause had 4 inches of height and over 100 pounds. His arms were longer. His reach was longer. His base of support was wider. Every metric of physical advantage that human beings have used since the beginning of combat to assess a fight pointed in one direction. Krause knew this. The 30 people watching knew this. The question, the only question that had ever mattered in any room where Bruce Lee stood across from a larger man, was whether those metrics meant what they usually meant. "You can begin," Bruce Lee said quietly. Krause nodded. He settled into his kickboxing stance. Organized, practiced, feet correctly placed, weight balanced with the particular intelligence of a man who has been hit before and has learned from being hit. His hands came up, his chin came down. He was not casual about this. He was not performing contempt the way some men did against smaller opponents.
He was treating it seriously from the first second. That was the correct instinct. It didn't help him. He threw a testing jab, not full speed, a calibration, exactly the same kind of intelligent opening that any high-level fighter uses in the first seconds, sending something out to gather information without committing.
2 seconds. 2 seconds in which the following things happened in sequence so compressed that the 30 witnesses would spend the rest of the afternoon disagreeing about the order. Bruce Lee's lead arm came up, not a block, an intercept. The Jeet Kune Do principle made physical. Meet the attack at its origin. Redirect it at the source before it builds force. His forearm made contact with Krause's extending arm at the elbow, not the wrist. Earlier in the chain, where the redirection costs the least effort and produces the most change in trajectory. Krause's right hand went wide, a few degrees, enough. In the space that the redirection created, that razor-thin corridor of geometry that opened for approximately a quarter of a second, Bruce Lee's right hand moved. People who were watching said later that they did not see the strike. They saw the preparation for the strike, and then they saw the result of the strike. And the strike itself existed in the gap between those two things, in a sliver of time that the human eye cannot subdivide finely enough to catch. What they saw was Krause's body responding to something they had not fully seen happen. His head snapped back, not from impact to the head. Bruce Lee had not struck his head. He had struck his solar plexus. The snap of the head was the body's systemic response to a massive disruption of the nerve center beneath the sternum, the involuntary system overriding the voluntary one. The body briefly shutting down non-essential processes to deal with the electrical storm that had just been delivered to its center. Krause did not fall. He was too big and too experienced to fall from one strike, even that one. But his legs, those legs that had carried him through 9 years of kickboxing and dozens of uncategorized fights in rooms without referees, his legs bent, both knees, 6 inches toward the floor. His hands dropped from their guard position to somewhere between his chest and his waist, seeking instinctively to protect the place that hurt. He stood there for 3 full seconds with his knees bent and his hands low and his head back and his eyes blinking the specific blink of a man whose system is rebooting. 3 seconds. On a film set in Hong Kong, in front of 30 people who were not supposed to be watching. Bruce Lee stood exactly where he had been when he threw the strike. He had not moved back. He had not moved forward to follow up. He simply stood, his right hand returned to its neutral position, his weight balanced, his breathing exactly the same as it had been before the exchange began. He was looking at Krause with the same diagnostic expression he had used at the beginning, gathering information, noting results. There was no triumph in his posture. There was no performance of dominance, no widening of stance, no jawline thrust forward. He stood the way water stands, occupying its shape without insisting on it. Krause straightened. It took him 4 seconds to fully straighten. He stood with his hands at his sides and looked at Bruce Lee across the 8 feet between them. The 30 people at the perimeter did not make a sound. It was the journalist who broke the silence years later when he finally told part of the story to someone he trusted. I have seen crowds react to extraordinary things, a goal, a speech, a piece of music that changes the temperature of a room. What I saw in those people's faces in that moment was not the reaction to something extraordinary. It was the reaction to something that should not have been possible. There is a difference. The first produces noise. The second produces silence. Krause spoke first. Again, he said. His voice was even, controlled. Whatever had just happened to his body had not touched the essential thing in him, the professional core, the part that processes experience as data rather than humiliation. Bruce Lee looked at him for a moment. Why? he said, not unkindly, genuinely curious. Krauss thought about it. Because I do not understand what you did, and I do not accept things I do not understand. There was a pause. That, Bruce Lee said, is exactly the right reason. They reset. The second exchange lasted 11 seconds. 11 seconds that the 30 witnesses, who collectively had decades of martial arts, boxing, stunt work, and combat sports experience among them, would, in the years following, describe in terms that sounded more like poetry than sports analysis. Because what happened in those 11 seconds was not a fight. A fight is two systems colliding. What those 11 seconds contained was something more like a demonstration, not of superiority, but of principle, of the idea that Bruce Lee had been refining for 15 years, made visible in real time against a real opponent who was genuinely trying. Krauss came forward, changed levels, changed timing, changed angle, each adaptation intelligent, each adjustment real. He was not cooperating, he was hunting with everything he had. Bruce Lee answered each adaptation with a single word written in movement: earlier. He was always earlier, earlier in the sequence, earlier in the chain of events, before the intention became movement, before the movement became committed, before commitment became force. He touched Krauss 7 times in 11 seconds. Not full power strikes, not attempts to damage, 7 touches. On the shoulder, the side of the neck, the right knee, the hip, the jaw, a whisper of contact that turned Krauss's head 4 degrees, the floating rib on the opposite side from the first exchange. Finally, the sternum again, the same strike, delivered from a different angle after Krauss had spent 11 seconds trying every adjustment he knew to prevent exactly that from happening. 7 touches. Krauss landed nothing. Not because he didn't try, not because he wasn't good enough to normally connect, because Bruce Lee lived in the space between the decision and the arrival, and nothing that came for him ever found him there. When it was over, when the 11 seconds had finished, and both men breathing in the cleared space on the edge of the film set, Krauss put both hands flat on his own knees and bent forward and breathed for a moment. Then he straightened. He looked at Bruce Lee, and he did something that nobody in that circle had expected. He laughed. Not a bitter laugh, not the laugh of a man covering humiliation, a genuine laugh, the helpless, surrendering laugh of someone who has just encountered the answer to a question, and the answer has made the question itself seem naive. "I have been fighting for 9 years," he said. He was still catching his breath. Not once, not understood what was happening to me. He put his hand out. Bruce Lee shook it. "Now you understand something. That is worth more than winning," Bruce Lee said quietly. That is where Section 1 ends. The set went back to work, the cameras resumed, the film continued, and 30 people carried a story they mostly chose not to tell, each for their own reasons, each protecting something they instinctively understood was too precise for the public record. But the principle that governed every second of those 4 minutes on that concrete space in Hong Kong in 1972, the principle that allowed 135 pounds to reach a 240-pound professional fighter 7 times in 11 seconds without being touched once, that principle was not a secret. Bruce Lee had been saying it for years. Nobody had listened the right way, until they felt it.
The film set returned to its rhythms within 20 minutes. Marks were reset, lighting was adjusted, the assistant director called positions, and the crew moved back into the organized choreography of production. Cables were repositioned, reflectors angled. Someone brought tea in small paper cups and distributed them without being asked, the way crew members on long shoots develop instincts for the moments when people need something warm to hold. But something had changed in the room's atmosphere, something that didn't reset with the cameras. The 30 people who had stood at that perimeter moved through the rest of that day differently, quieter, more careful with their words. You could see it in the way they looked at Bruce Lee when he moved back in front of the cameras, not with the casual familiarity of a crew that has worked alongside someone for weeks, but with the slightly recalibrated attention of people who have been shown that their previous calibration was insufficient. They had thought they understood what they were working with. They had been corrected. Willem Krause stayed on the set for 2 hours after the exchange. He didn't leave immediately, the way a man might who was processing humiliation and needed to remove himself from the location of it. He stayed. He found a position near one of the equipment cases at the edge of the shooting area, and he sat, and he watched Bruce Lee work. He watched him run the training sequence the cameras had been set up to capture. He watched him move through the choreography, which, even when it was movie choreography, even when it was designed for a camera rather than for combat, carried within it the same underlying grammar as everything Krause had just experienced in that cleared space, the same economy, the same refusal of wasted motion, the same quality of arriving at the correct position before the correct position had been announced. After about 40 minutes of watching, Krause turned to the man standing nearest him, one of the stunt coordinators, a quiet Hong Kong fighter named Chen who had been on Bruce Lee's productions for 2 years. How long did it take him to move like that? How many years? Chen thought about it seriously, the way the question deserved. It is the wrong question. Years is the wrong unit. You could train for 40 years and not move like that. The years are not what made him. What made him is that he never trained the same thing twice. Every session, he was looking for what was wrong with what he knew. Most people train to confirm what they already believe. He trained to find where his belief was incorrect. Krause was quiet for a moment. "That is a very uncomfortable way to train," he said. "Yes," Chen said simply. "That is probably why more people do not do it." Bruce Lee was aware that Krause was still there. He was aware of everything in a room. It was not supernatural. It was the developed perceptual acuity of a man who had spent 15 years training himself to read environments in real time, to process the position and emotional state of every body in his immediate vicinity as baseline data. It was a skill, built, earned, the product of more training hours than most people accumulate in a lifetime. He knew Krause was watching. He knew what Krause was processing. He had seen it before. The specific quality of attention that a professional fighter brings to a situation after an experience they cannot immediately categorize. The hunger to understand that exists in certain kinds of people who have built their identity on understanding and have just encountered something that temporarily exceeded their understanding. He recognized it because it was the same quality of attention he brought to everything. Between setups, while the crew was repositioning cameras for a new angle, Bruce Lee walked to the edge of the set and stood near the equipment case where Krause was sitting. He didn't make a ceremony of it. He simply stopped near him as if he had been passing anyway. "You have questions," he said, not a question. Krause looked up. "Many." Bruce Lee sat down on the edge of the equipment case across from him. He had a small towel around his neck and a cup of tea in his right hand, and he looked in that moment less like the concentrated force that had touched a professional fighter 7 times in 11 seconds, and more like a man in his early 30s who had been working since 6 in the morning and was glad to sit down for a moment. "Ask," Bruce Lee said.
Here is the thing about Bruce Lee that the movies get wrong. Not the choreography. The choreography is its own art form, its own valid language, and he was a master of it, the way he was a master of everything he committed to. The movies are not the lie. The lie is the presentation of what he was as primarily physical, as a body doing things to other bodies, as speed and power and precision arranged for the pleasure of an audience. That was the smallest part of him. The largest part, the part that sent Willem Krause to sit on an equipment case for an hour watching him work, the part that made a journalist put his notebook in a drawer for 11 years, the part that made Muhammad Ali sit on a gymnasium floor and press his chest to him and say, "What was that?" The largest part was the thinking. Bruce Lee was a philosopher who had chosen the human body as his instrument of inquiry. Every strike, every drill, every obsessive training hour, every early morning run through streets that hadn't woken up yet, all of it was in service of a single sustained question. What is actually true about how a human being can move and apply force and read intention and close distance and stop another human being? Not what was traditionally believed to be true, not what the styles said, not what the masters had handed down, what was actually, demonstrably, testably true. He tested everything, against resistant partners, against people who were trying to hit him back, against large people, small people, fast people, strong people, against people who had trained in systems completely different from anything he had studied, because those were the most useful test subjects. They came with assumptions his system didn't share, and assumptions you don't share are the most honest test of whether your principles are real or merely local. This is what Krauss had given him that morning, without knowing it. A Dutch kickboxer with 9 years of real experience and a genuinely scientific mind had walked onto a film set and offered himself as a test. And the test had confirmed what Bruce Lee already knew, but was always perpetually, relentlessly interested in confirming again. The principles held. The weight reading held. The interception held. The access held. The data was good. That was what mattered to him. Not the winning, the data. 32 years old. That is how old he was when he died. 27 days before Enter the Dragon was released, 27 days before the world finally saw, through the deliberate compression and dramatization of a commercial film, some partial reflection of what he was capable of. The world mourned a movie star. The 30 people who stood at that perimeter in Hong Kong in 1972, and the handful who had witnessed the 1967 session with Ali, and the dozens of training partners across a decade and a half of obsessive work, they mourned something more specific and more irreplaceable. They mourned an open question that had been canceled before it could be fully answered. Because Bruce Lee at 32 was not finished. He was not at his peak and declining. He was still building, still refining, still testing, still finding the ceiling above his ceiling and pressing against it. The shoulder strike that had numbed Ali's arm, the solar plexus access point that had dropped Krauss's guard, the weight reading that allowed him to intercept at the origin of intention rather than the destination of movement. All of it was still being refined, made more precise, made more economical, made more devastating with less. What he would have been at 40 is not a thing anyone can calculate. The calculation was interrupted. What survives is not the man. It cannot be. What survives is the principle. And the principle is this. The body is not the weapon. The body is what the weapon passes through. The weapon is understanding. The weapon is the accumulated, tested, honest knowledge of how force actually works. Not how it is supposed to work according to tradition, not how it looks in a demonstration, but how it behaves in the specific moment when a real opponent is genuinely trying to prevent it from working. A smaller person can stop a larger person. This is not inspiring sentiment. This is physics. Force is not volume. Force is alignment, timing, and the intelligent selection of the correct vector at the correct instant. A small force applied correctly outperforms a large force applied incorrectly every single time, because reality does not grade on effort, it grades on accuracy. This is not a comfortable principle. It requires the practitioner to continuously abandon what they know in order to find what is actually true. It requires the specific courage of being wrong, of having your carefully built framework tested against something that doesn't respect the framework, and following the evidence rather than protecting the belief. Most people cannot do this. Most people, when the framework fails, defend the framework, call the test unfair, change the subject, find a reason why this particular data point doesn't count. Bruce Lee did the opposite. Every failure of the framework was the most interesting thing that had happened all week.
Every moment where something he believed turned out to be wrong was a gift of the kind that Krauss had described, the ceiling becoming visible, the sky still somewhere above it. Hong Kong, 1972. A cleared space on the edge of a film set. 30 people watching. A 240-pound professional fighter with 9 real years and a genuinely scientific mind. 11 seconds. 7 touches. 0 returned. Then 2 men sitting on equipment cases in the in-between time of a filming day, one asking questions and one answering them with the patience of someone who has been waiting for genuinely good questions for longer than the conversation would suggest. No footage exists of that morning. The film cameras were pointing the other direction and nobody thought to redirect them, or perhaps somebody thought not to redirect them, which is a different thing. There are no photographs. The journalist's notebook stayed in his desk. The Dutch interview circulates in partial translation among people who are already looking for it. What remains is the story, imperfect, incomplete, carried forward in the mouths of people who were there, and then in the mouths of people who knew people who were there, and then, inevitably, eventually, out into the wider world, changed by each retelling in the way that all true things change without becoming untrue. The essential facts survived the changes. A large man brought his best. A smaller man was already where the best wasn't going. 7 times in 11 seconds. And then a conversation on equipment cases about weight and intention and the difference between response and anticipation, while 30 people moved quietly around the edges of the space and tried to figure out how to carry what they'd just seen. "Be water," he said. He said it in many contexts across many years, and people have interpreted it in many ways, as flexibility, as adaptability, as the willingness to change shape to fit the container. All of those interpretations are valid, none of them are complete. The interpretation that the people who trained with him reached gradually over years was simpler and harder. Water does not wait to react. Water does not see the obstacle and then decide to move around it. Water is already moving in every direction that is available to it at every moment. It does not think about the rock. It is water. The rock is simply a piece of information about which directions are currently available and which are not. Water processes this information and continues being water. A fighter who has truly understood this principle does not react to the strike. He is already present in the space where the strike is not going to land, because he read the weight before the intention became decision, and the decision before it became movement, and the movement before it became arrival. He is not ahead of you in time. He is earlier in the chain of the same moment. He is reading the first word of the sentence while you are still forming the thought to begin it. That is water. That is what Willem Krauss felt 7 times in 11 seconds on a concrete floor in Hong Kong. That is what Muhammad Ali felt sitting on a gymnasium mat in Los Angeles, pressing his hand to his chest, reaching for language for something that had no language. That is what 30 people carried home from a film set, quiet, recalibrated, trying to find the right filing cabinet for something that wouldn't fit. He was 32 years old. He had been asking the same question for 15 years, refining the answer with every training session, every honest test, every moment of being wrong and following the wrongness to what was right. He never stopped asking. The question outlived him. The answer, partial, still unfinished, still being tested by everyone who inherited the work, is out here in the world. In the weight shift before the intention, in the step that is earlier in the chain, in the understanding that the body is not the weapon, that size is not the final word, that speed is not even the right concept, because speed implies chasing, and chasing is already too late. The right concept is earlier. Always earlier. One step closer to the beginning of the thing. That is where Bruce Lee lived. That is where no one could follow him. That is where he remains.